The Galactic Council issued humanity a final warning. Their reply turned the stars cold. The dossier landed on my desk at 300 hours, and I knew before I opened it that everything was about to change. 312 pages. The cover read, "Final Notice of Compliance, issued to the human delegation by authority of the Galactic Council, Cycle 7441. I had been an ambassador for 11 years. I had sat through trade disputes, border negotiations, and 2 separate war prevention summits. I had never seen the words "final notice" on anything the Council produced, until now. My name is Kale Marin. I represent 8 billion people in a chamber designed for 40,000 civilizations, and on the morning that dossier arrived, I was the only human being within 4 light years. The observation deck of our delegation ship, the carrier-class vessel Earth designated the Pathfinder, faced the conclave station directly. I stood at the glass and looked at it, a structure the size of a small moon, ringed with docking arms and communication arrays, glowing faintly amber in the light of a distant star that had no name in any human language. I had stood at this same window dozens of times. It had never felt like a threat before. That morning it did. I opened the dossier. The Council had listed 17 violations, not suggestions, not concerns. Violations, a word that carried legal weight under the Galactic Accord, the founding document that governed every space-faring civilization in this region of the galaxy. I read through each one slowly, because I had learned long ago that the worst thing a diplomat can do is react before he understands. Violation 1. Unauthorized colonization of restricted expansion zones. We had settled 4 planetary systems that the Council had designated as protected buffer space. Nobody had lived there. The planets were not inhabited. 2 of them were dying, 1 had a decaying magnetosphere, and our engineers had actually stabilized it within 8 years of arrival. The Council's report did not mention that part. Violation 7. Refusal to surrender advanced propulsion and energy technology under the Shared Knowledge Mandate. Humanity had developed a fold drive system that cut travel time between star systems by a factor of 9. The Council wanted it. We said no. Not because we were selfish, because the mandate had a clause that transferred partial ownership of any shared technology to the governing body, and we had watched 3 other species hand over their greatest discoveries, only to find themselves dependent on Council approval for further development. We were not going to make that mistake. Violation 12. The Vega Station Incident. I stopped reading when I got to that one. I set the dossier down and looked at the stars for a long moment. Vega Station had been a miscalculation. One of our early deep-range communication relays had emitted a signal pulse that interfered with a Council navigation beacon. No ships were lost. No one was harmed. But the disruption had lasted 6 hours, and during those 6 hours, a Council trade convoy had taken an unplanned detour that added 11 days to their journey. The financial loss was documented and logged. What the report did not mention was that we had identified the problem, corrected the relay, and compensated the affected trading companies, all within 72 hours. The Council's own repair estimate for the beacon had been 3 months. We fixed it in 11 days. Reading through all 17 points felt like reading a list of things we had done to survive, written by people who had never needed to. At 700, I received a formal summons to the main chamber. Full session. All delegations present. I put on my formal coat, drank the last of my coffee, and walked into the most important meeting of my life without a single note prepared. The chamber was extraordinary as it always was. An enormous circular space with tiered seating arranged around a central platform. The ceiling was transparent, and beyond it, stars stretched in every direction. 40,000 species had seats here, though not all were occupied at any given time. That morning, the chamber was nearly full. Word had traveled fast. Everyone wanted to watch what happened to the humans. I took my seat at the human delegation's table. A single table, 1 chair, one human, and waited. Archon Vereth of the Dominari rose to speak. The Dominari were the Council's oldest active enforcement body. They were tall, broad-shouldered beings with dense, dark plating across their upper bodies, and eyes that processed light in spectrums humans could not see. Vereth was their senior representative, and he had been in this chamber longer than the entire span of recorded human spaceflight. He spoke slowly, and his translator rendered each word in a flat, precise tone that somehow made everything sound like a verdict. "The Galactic Council," he said, "having reviewed the conduct of the human civilization across a period of 31 standard cycles, and having issued 4 prior notices of concern, each of which was acknowledged and disregarded, hereby delivers to the human delegation a final directive." He read the terms clearly and without pause. Humanity would surrender governance of 14 of its colonial settlements to joint council administration. Humanity would provide full technical documentation for the Fold Drive system within 60 cycles. Humanity would submit to a standing inspection agreement covering all military and research installations, and humanity would formally acknowledge, in writing, the authority of the Galactic Council as the supreme governing body of this region of space. Failure to comply with all 4 conditions within 90 cycles would result in collective quarantine, total severance from galactic trade networks, communication blackout, and physical exclusion from all council-governed space lanes. Every other civilization in the chamber would be legally required to cut ties. No exceptions. Vereth finished speaking and sat down. I did not stand. I did not speak. The protocol in that moment was to accept the summons, return to one's delegation quarters, and respond within the allotted time. I had 72 hours. I stood up, nodded once to the chamber in acknowledgement, and walked out. Back aboard the Pathfinder, I sat at my communications terminal and typed one message to Earth. I kept it short because there was no way to make it not short. They have done it. 4 conditions, 90 cycles, or collective quarantine. Tell me what to say. I sent it and waited. Deep space communication to Earth took time. Even with relay boosters along the route, a signal required hours to make the round trip. I had 72 hours total. The message would arrive on Earth in roughly 3 hours. A reply would take another 3 to reach me. That left me 66 hours to prepare and deliver humanity's formal response. I made tea. I looked out at the conclave station. I thought about the 11 species that had faced final notices before us. I had looked up their histories once years ago out of professional curiosity. Only 2 of them had complied. The others had resisted. None of those were in the chamber today, not because they had been destroyed in some dramatic confrontation. They had simply faded, quarantined, isolated, starved of contact and trade until their civilizations collapsed inward and went quiet. I thought about that for a long time. 6 hours after I sent my message, 3 hours faster than the math suggested, a reply arrived from Earth. Not from the diplomatic corps, not from the Foreign Affairs Office or the Council liaison team. It came directly from the Secretary General's personal terminal. Her name was Patricia Aldrin, and she had been in office for 6 years. I had met her twice. Both times she had struck me as someone who thought in long sentences but spoke in short ones. The message was 3 sentences. I read them once, then I read them again. My hands, which I had not noticed were shaking until that moment, went completely still. Something settled in my chest, not calm exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular feeling of having been lost and then finding, unexpectedly, that you had known the way the entire time. I read the 3 sentences one more time. Then I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled in 11 days. I folded the message carefully, set it beside my terminal, and began to work. I had 66 hours. I was going to need every one of them. I spent the first 12 of those hours reading. Not the dossier. I had already read that 3 times. I pulled the Council's own archive access, which our delegation had been granted as a procedural courtesy when we joined 31 years ago, and I started digging. The archive was enormous, centuries of records, trade agreements, border resolutions, species classification documents, historical accounts of council interventions. Most of it was routine. Some of it was extraordinary. I searched specifically for two things: human references and quarantine precedents. The human references were more extensive than I expected. We had been observed long before we made contact with the first council species. 70 years before our first official delegation, council observation probes had been in our solar system. They had filed reports. Those reports were now part of the archive, and I could read them. I did. All of them. It took 4 hours, and by the end my tea had gone cold twice and I had forgotten to drink it either time. The council had been watching us since before we reached the moon. Early reports classified us as Category 3, a pre-space civilization with high internal conflict potential and unpredictable developmental trajectory. Standard language for a young species. By the time we developed the first crude faster-than-light prototypes, the classification had been updated. Category 2, an emerging space-faring civilization with anomalous acceleration rate. Note for review. What they meant by anomalous acceleration was this. Every other species in the Council's observation record had followed a predictable curve. They developed language, then agriculture, then basic technology, then industry, then information networks, then space capability, each step taking roughly the expected number of generations. Humanity had followed the same steps but had compressed the timeline in ways that made the Council's models produce errors. We were not supposed to have reached space when we did. We were not supposed to have had the propulsion systems we built in the time we built them. Every time their projections said we would plateau, we accelerated instead. The note in our file, written by a council analyst who had since retired, read, "This species responds to obstacles by moving faster. Recommend continued observation. Do not interfere." Someone had underlined that last part and added a single word in a script I did not recognize. The translator rendered it as, "Agreed." I sat with that for a moment, then I kept reading. The quarantine precedents were harder to find. They were not archived under the word quarantine. They were filed under a phrase that translated loosely as administrative cessation protocol. I found 14 cases over the last 2 millennia. In 12 of those cases, the species involved had been given a final notice similar to mine. In 4 of those 12 cases, the species had attempted to resist. All 4 were gone. Not gone in the way of a dramatic last stand. Gone in the slow, quiet way of a civilization that stops being able to sustain itself, because everything it needs has been cut off. 2 of those 4 had actually been growing before the quarantine. One of them had been building new colony ships when the blockade hit. It did not matter. Isolation is a patient force. Given enough time, it wins. I noted all of this down carefully. I was building something, though I was not yet sure exactly what shape it would take. At the 18-hour mark, I went to the Council's Xenoanthropology wing. It was a public research section of the conclave station, accessible to any accredited delegate. I had been there once before, years ago, for a conference on interspecies communication standards. It was a quiet, long space with curved walls and soft light. The researchers there were small, pale beings called the Valorian, a species that had been council members for over 4,000 years and had made a civilization out of watching other civilizations. I found the human exhibit without much difficulty. It was a mid-sized installation, not large enough to suggest importance, not small enough to suggest dismissal. A classification panel at the entrance read the following, in standard Galactic script that my implant translated without effort. Species human, origin 3rd planet Sol system, council membership duration 31 cycles, category unpredictable, threat ceiling unquantifiable, recommended posture containment. I stood in front of that panel for a long time. Unpredictable, Threat ceiling unquantifiable. Those were not insults. In council terminology, unpredictable meant a species whose behavior could not be reliably modeled. Threat ceiling unquantifiable meant the council's analysts had tried to determine the upper limit of our potential and had been unable to arrive at a number. In other words, they had tried to figure out how powerful we could become. They had failed to find a ceiling. I had not known that before. I was not sure what to do with it, but I stored it carefully. A voice behind me said, "You read Valorian fast for a human." I turned. One of the researchers was watching me, a slight figure in pale gray, with large, dark eyes that were common to their species. He introduced himself as S-Sen. He had been studying humanities file for 6 years. He said this without any particular weight, the way someone mentions a long-term project they are quietly proud of. We talked for 2 hours. Mostly I listened. S-Sen was careful with his words, pausing often, watching my face as he spoke as though checking that each sentence had landed correctly before releasing the next. He told me things he probably should not have. I did not ask him to. He offered them because, he said, he had spent 6 years learning how humans think, and he believed I deserved to understand the full picture. The Dominari had proposed something to the full council 3 weeks ago, a measure that went beyond collective quarantine. He did not use the council term for it directly. He said there was no clean translation. It described a type of intervention that the council had used twice in its entire history, both times on civilizations that had been deemed a structural threat to galactic stability. It was not a blockade. It was not an isolation. It was the kind of decision that ended things permanently. He said it had been proposed and blocked. 3 council elders had refused to let it proceed to a vote. He would not tell me which 3. He would not tell me exactly what they had said. But he told me the reason, and the reason had been documented in the session record. The 3 elders had reviewed the full archive on human civilization, every observation report, every filed record, every projection model, and they had made a decision. Their stated reason, entered into the official record, was, "We have watched the recordings of their history. We will not be the civilization that provokes them." I thanked S-Sen. He nodded and went back to his work. I walked back to the Pathfinder. It was 30 hours before my deadline now. I had the shape of something in my mind, but it was not yet complete. I called Earth again, not a formal communication, just a direct channel to the Secretary General's office. Her aide answered. I told him what S-Sen had told me. There was a pause. Then the aide said he would pass it along and asked me to hold. Patricia Aldrin came on herself 7 minutes later. Her voice was steady and precise, the way it always was. I told her everything. The archive, the classification, S-Sen, the measure that had been proposed and blocked, the reason the 3 elders had given. I told her all of it. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that I checked whether the connection was still active. Then she said, "We know, we have known for 2 weeks, keep going." The line closed. I sat in my chair aboard the Pathfinder and thought about what it meant that Earth had known the full scope of what was on the table, and had still sent me 3 sentences and told me to keep going. I thought about it for a while. Then I stopped thinking about it, because understanding it was not what I needed right now. What I needed was to finish building what I had started. I worked through the night. By the time the conclave's amber-lit morning cycle began outside my window, I had something I believed in. Not a speech exactly, not a rebuttal, something older than either of those, a statement of fact, a reading of the record presented plainly by someone who had done his homework. I printed it on paper, actual paper. I had kept a small stock of it for occasions when I needed to think through something physically. I printed the full document and read it once from beginning to end, standing at my desk in the quiet of the ship, while the stars sat still outside the window. Then I changed into my formal coat, tucked the pages under my arm, and walked back into the chamber. The full session was already assembled. Every tier was occupied. The light from 10,000 observation feeds filled the upper ring of the chamber with a faint, electric blue. 40,000 civilizations, watching from their seats or from screens across the galaxy, watching to see what the humans would say. I stepped onto the central platform. I set my prepared speech on the podium. Then I looked at it for a moment, picked it up and set it aside. I unfolded the paper instead. And I began. The room was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. I had spoken in this chamber many times over 11 years. Trade resolutions, clarification requests, goodwill addresses. Each time the room had maintained its usual ambient hum, the quiet, ongoing noise of 40,000 species processing simultaneous translation feeds, the faint mechanical breath of atmospheric management systems, the occasional movement from the upper tiers. It was never truly silent in the conclave chamber. It was a room built for ongoing civilization. But as I stood on the central platform with the folded pages in my hand and began to speak, the room went quiet in a way I had never experienced there before. Not the silence of shock, the silence of attention, complete, focused, total attention. The kind that only arrives when something is being said that everyone in the room suspects they will not forget. I did not open with an apology. I had considered it a gesture of diplomatic goodwill, an acknowledgement of the Council's concerns before addressing them. I had written 3 different versions of an opening apology during the night. I had deleted all 3, not because I was being defiant, because an apology would have suggested that the framing of the dossier was correct, and it was not. I opened with the violations. The Council's dossier lists 17 points of noncompliance, I said. I am not going to dispute the list. Every item on it is accurate. I am going to explain each one in order because I believe the Council deserves to understand not just what humanity did, but why, and I believe that once you do, you will see that every decision we made followed the same logic. The same logic that has governed every decision humanity has made for the entirety of its recorded history. I went through the violations one by one. The 4 colonial settlements in restricted expansion zones. I explained that all 4 planets had been assessed by our scientists before settlement. 2 were uninhabited and resource stable. 1 had a failing magnetosphere that our engineers had stabilized within 8 years. 1 had been listed on the Council's own internal schedule for survey, a survey that had not been conducted in over 200 cycles due to administrative backlog. We had not invaded protected space. We had moved into abandoned space and made it livable. We sent formal notification of each settlement to the Council's expansion registry, I said. The notifications are in the archive. They were received and logged. No response was issued. We interpreted silence as non-objection. We were apparently wrong about that. We should have been told clearly. We were not. The full drive refusal. I read the exact language of the shared knowledge mandate, specifically the clause transferring partial technological ownership to the governing body. I then read the case histories of 3 species who had shared technology under this mandate and had subsequently found themselves unable to develop the next generation of that technology without Council approval, which in 2 cases had been withheld for political reasons. We decline not out of selfishness, I said, but out of a straightforward reading of precedent. We are prepared to discuss a modified agreement. We have always been prepared to discuss a modified agreement. No one asked. Vega Station, I kept this one brief. I read the timeline. Error identified at hour 1. Correction begun at hour 2. Full resolution at hour 11. Compensation to affected trade parties completed within 72 hours. Council's own repair estimate for the affected beacon, 90 days. Actual time taken, 11 days. We do not consider this a violation, I said. We consider this an error that we fixed. We are sorry for the disruption. We are not sorry for fixing it faster than it had ever been fixed before. I worked through all 17 points the same way, not dismissing them, not minimizing them, but placing each one in its actual context. By the time I reached the end of the list, I could feel the room had changed. There was a quality to the attention around me that had shifted. I had come in expecting the room to be adversarial. It was something else now. It was uncertain. 40,000 civilizations recalibrating. Then I turned the page. The Council has issued collective quarantine to 14 civilizations in the last 2,000 years, I said. I have reviewed all 14 cases. In 12 of those cases, the species involved was issued a final notice similar to the one I received 4 days ago. 4 of those 12 species attempted to resist the quarantine. All 4 are no longer present in this chamber today. I paused, let that settle. I want to address that directly. The Council's position, as I understand it, is that quarantine is a corrective measure, a way of encouraging compliance through the pressure of isolation. And I understand why it has worked in the past. Isolation is a powerful force. Cut off a civilization from trade, from communication, from the movement of resources and people, and in time the civilization weakens. It makes decisions born of desperation rather than strength. It begins to agree to things it would not have agreed to from a position of stability. That is the mechanism. I understand it. I turned another page. But I need the Council to understand something about humanity, not as a threat, not as defiance, as a factual statement of our history which is in your archive, which you have been observing for over a century, and which I believe you know but have perhaps not fully considered in this context. I looked up from the pages. I looked at the chamber, all of it, the full circle of tears, the thousands of faces and forms and sensory apparatuses turned toward me. Humanity has never stayed down, I said. Not once. In the entirety of our recorded history, which spans roughly 5,000 years of civilization, we have faced extinction-level pressures on 7 separate occasions. Massive environmental shifts, catastrophic conflicts that reshaped entire continents, plagues that reduced our population by fractions that, in a smaller species, would have meant the end. Each time we lost ground. Each time we grieved. Each time something in us refused to accept the new condition as permanent, and we rebuilt not to the previous level but beyond it, every single time. The chamber was very still. This is not a boast, I said. I want to be precise about that. This is a pattern, a behavioral pattern so consistent across our entire history that it is not a choice anymore. It is simply what we do. We do not decide to get back up. We get back up because not getting back up is not something our civilization has ever successfully learned to do. I turned to the last page, the Secretary General's 3 sentences. I had thought about how to introduce them. In the end, I decided not to introduce them at all. I just read them. The Secretary General of Earth, Patricia Aldrin, asked me to deliver the following as humanity's formal response to the final notice. I quote directly. The 3 sentences were not a threat. They were not a declaration. They were an observation, a plain, factual observation about a pattern of behavior that 5,000 years of human history had demonstrated with complete consistency. They said, "We have been here before. We have always found a way forward. We are not asking for permission to continue doing so." I folded the paper. I would like to add one line of my own, I said. It is not in the official response. It is my personal assessment, as the human being who has sat in this chamber for 11 years and watched how the Council operates. I looked at Archon Verith. A quarantine works when the civilization being quarantined is capable of accepting its situation and becoming smaller over time. We have studied your history, Archon, and we respect what the Council has built across thousands of years. But we must be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing that serves either of us here. We are not capable of becoming smaller. We have tried, across our history in different forms under different circumstances, and it has never held. We adapt. We grow, we find the way through. This is not defiance. This is description. And we believe with great respect that the Council deserves an accurate description of what it is considering. I picked up my papers. We are ready to negotiate on every point in the dossier. We have always been ready to negotiate. What we are not able to do is sign a document promising to stop being what we are. We hope the Council will find, on reflection, that they would not want us to. I stepped off the platform. The silence lasted 11 seconds. I counted. Then the translation matrices began to work again, thousands of them simultaneously, and the chamber filled with the sound of 40,000 civilizations processing the same information at the same time and arriving, each in their own way, at the same uncomfortable place. I walked back to my seat. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I did not know what would happen next. I did not need to. The thing I had come here to say had been said. The rest belonged to the room. I sat down and waited. 3 days passed. I had not slept well. I had slept a few hours here, a few hours there, but not well. The Pathfinder was quiet and the stars outside my window were steady and unchanged, and there was absolutely nothing for me to do but wait, which is the hardest kind of work a person can be asked to do. The Council had gone dark, no formal response, no procedural acknowledgement, no communication of any kind. In 11 years of working with the Council, I had never experienced a full communications blackout from them. They were, as a governing body, extraordinarily procedural. They responded to things. They logged things. They issued notices and receipts and formal confirmations for even minor exchanges. The silence was not a technical failure. It was a choice. And choices like that, made by bodies like the Council, usually meant that something significant was being discussed in rooms I was not invited into. On the morning of the 4th day, I received my first piece of actual information. It came through the intelligence relay that the Pathfinder maintained independently, a secure channel that Earth's diplomatic corps used for sensitive information. The report was short. 3 Dominari battle fleets, which had been positioned in sectors adjacent to human colonial space for the past several weeks, had moved, not toward us, away from us. They had repositioned in defensive formations around Dominari core worlds, 3 of the species' most significant inhabited systems, and they were staying there. I read that report twice, then I read it a 3rd time. A defensive repositioning is a specific kind of military posture. It means something has happened that has changed the calculation of what needs protecting. When a species that has been facing outward, toward a potential adversary, suddenly turns inward and positions itself between its own home worlds and everything else, it is not an act of aggression. It is an act of reassessment. The Dominari were not getting ready to enforce the quarantine. They were getting ready to protect themselves from something they had not previously felt they needed to protect themselves from. I sat with that for a long time. Sen came to see me on the afternoon of the 4th day. He did not send a request in advance. He simply appeared at the Pathfinder's docking bay and asked if he could come aboard. I let him in. We sat in the small meeting room off the main corridor, 2 mugs of tea between us, and he talked. He looked different from when I had met him in the research wing. The careful, measured quality he had carried before, the researcher's composure, was still there, but underneath it was something else. He was shaken. Not frightened exactly, but shaken in the way of a person who has spent years building a model of how something works and has just watched the model stop being accurate. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want to be clear that in telling you I am acting on my own judgment. This is not officially sanctioned." "I understand," I said. "The measure I mentioned to you before, the one that was proposed 3 weeks ago and blocked, I told you that 3 council elders had refused to let it proceed to a vote. I told you they had stated their reason in the record." He paused. "I did not tell you the full statement at the time. I was not sure it was appropriate. I have reconsidered." He reached into his bag and produced a small data card. He set it on the table between us, but did not slide it toward me. "The 3 elders who blocked the measure," he said, "made their statement jointly. It was entered into the session record. The relevant portion reads as follows." He looked at the card. "After reviewing the complete observational archive on the human civilization, covering 112 years of documentation, we find that we are unable to recommend any action intended to terminate or permanently restrict this species' development. Our reasons are as follows. First, every intervention model we applied produced the same result. Humanity, when subjected to external pressure of any kind, isolation, resource restriction, physical threat, does not diminish. It accelerates. Our models cannot account for this reliably. Second, the historical record of this species contains no example of a civilizational collapse that was followed by permanent decline. In every case, within a generation or two, recovery exceeded the previous level. Third, we believe, based on 112 years of observation, that attempting to impose a permanent ceiling on this species would not succeed, and would instead produce a version of humanity that is no longer interested in being part of this council. SN stopped reading. The final sentence of their statement, he said, was the one that ended the discussion. It reads, "We have watched the recordings of their history, and we will not be the civilization that provokes them. If we are wrong about this, we will discover our error. If we are right, history will record that we were wise enough to know what we were looking at." I did not say anything for a moment. "Which elder wrote that last line?" I asked. "All three," he said. "They submitted the statement as a single joint document. None of them would take individual credit." I looked at my tea. It had gone cold again. "What happens now?" I asked. SN was quiet for a moment. "The council has convened a closed session. Not about the quarantine, not about any of the terms in the final notice. The agenda, as it has been described to me by someone who was present for the opening of the session, is the following question. How does the council build a functional relationship with a civilization it cannot contain, cannot reliably predict, and cannot outpace?" He picked up his tea, looked at it, set it back down. "There is no existing framework for that," he said. "In the council's history, this question has never been asked before. Every other civilization, no matter how capable, has followed a trajectory that the council could eventually model. Your species is the first one for which our best analysts cannot produce a confident long-range projection." "Because we keep surprising you," I said. "Because you keep surprising yourselves," he said. "That is actually the harder problem to model. A civilization that is surprised by its own capabilities cannot be bounded by external assumptions, because those assumptions will always be derived from what the civilization has already done. You always do something you have not done before." He stood to leave. "I want you to know," he said at the door, "that I do not believe the council is your enemy. I also do not believe they are your friends. I think they are a very old institution that has spent thousands of years believing it understood the range of what was possible, and you have spent 31 years quietly dismantling that belief without meaning to. That is a genuinely difficult thing to manage." "I know," I said. He nodded and left. That evening, I received a communiqué through the formal diplomatic channel. The sender was listed as the office of Archon Verath of the Dominari. This was unusual. The Dominari communicated through council channels as a matter of standard practice. A direct communication from Verath's personal office was, in diplomatic terms, a significant gesture. The message contained 4 words. They were written in English, human English, a language that Verath had never, in my 11 years in this chamber, been documented to speak or write in any public or private capacity. There was no translation notation. There was no diplomatic preamble, just 4 words. "We understand you now." I read them. I set my communicator down on my desk. I stood at the observation window for a long time. The conclave station floated in the middle distance, amber-lit, enormous, full of ancient minds working through new questions. Beyond it, stars, hundreds of them visible from this position. Some of them home to civilizations that had watched us, studied us, feared us a little in their way. All of them now sitting with the same understanding they had not quite had before. On Earth, I found out later through the broadcast relay, Patricia Aldrin gave a public address that same evening. She did not mention the council. She did not reference the final notice, the chamber session, any of it. She announced that 3 new deep space colonization fleets had been cleared for launch. Standard expansion mission parameters. New systems, new settlements, new ground to cover. The timing was not accidental. It was not a provocation either. That is important to understand. She was not drawing a line in the sand. She was simply continuing what we had always done. She was saying, without saying it, this is what we do. This is what we were doing before your final notice arrived, and it is what we will be doing after the discussion concludes. Somewhere in a closed session room aboard the conclave station, 40,000 civilizations were working on the hardest question their ancient institutions had ever asked themselves. And on Earth, we were already building the next ship. 6 months later, I was sitting in my kitchen in the city of Norwich, drinking the same brand of coffee I had been drinking since I was a graduate student, watching the morning light come through the window, and doing absolutely nothing of diplomatic significance whatsoever. It was, without question, one of the best mornings I could remember in a long time. My resignation had gone through 3 weeks after I returned from the conclave. It had been accepted without much ceremony, which I appreciated. The diplomatic corps had already identified my replacement before I handed in the paperwork. Her name was Amara Osai, 29 years old, a linguist from Lagos, fluent in 14 languages and working on a 15th. With a research background in interspecies communication theory and a calm, steady manner that I suspected would serve her significantly better in that chamber than my own particular brand of quiet stubbornness ever had. I had met her once, at the formal handover briefing. She had listened to everything I said with total attention and asked 3 questions at the end that demonstrated she had understood it all and had already thought 2 steps further. I had driven home from that meeting feeling something I had not expected to feel, genuine relief. Not the relief of someone escaping a burden, but the relief of someone who has passed something important into good hands. This morning, her first formal address to the Galactic Council was being broadcast on the relay feed that I still had running on my living room screen. I had turned the volume low and kept the kitchen door open so I could hear it while I made breakfast. Old habits. She was speaking about water, specifically about the hydrological survey data from the 3 new colonial systems that Patricia Aldrin's colonization fleets were in the process of reaching. She was laying the groundwork for an information-sharing agreement with 4 council species who had previously worked in those regions and had existing water resource data that would be enormously useful. It was careful, precise, practical diplomacy. It was the kind of work that would never make headlines, but would matter to every person who eventually settled those planets and needed to know where to dig their wells. Listening to her, I thought, she is better at this than I am. She will be better than I ever was. And in 20 years, whoever comes after her will be better still. That is the other thing they had never quite accounted for in their models. It is not just that we keep getting back up. It is that every generation that comes after us is built on what we learned from failing. We do not just recover. We incorporate the failure, understand it, and produce something that carries the lesson forward. The mistakes I made in my first 3 years as ambassador, I had made them so that Amara would never have to make them. She was starting further along the road than I had started, because I had walked it first and left markers. This is what growing means. Not just expansion, accumulation, the building of something that is larger than any one person, any one generation, any one brilliant choice or terrible error. We are not individuals who occasionally cooperate. We are a civilization that is genuinely attempting to build something that lasts, and we are willing to be embarrassed and wrong and inadequate in the short term in service of the long game. The Council had never quite understood that either. They had studied us individually, our physiology, our psychology, our social structures. But studying a human being is not the same as understanding what happens when you put several billion of them together across several thousand years and tell them they are building something that matters. The whole is not merely greater than the sum of the parts. The whole is a different category of thing entirely. I poured a second cup of coffee. On the screen, Amara had moved from water rights to atmospheric compatibility indices. 3 of the Council's scientific bodies had offered technical support. She was accepting graciously and folding each offer into a framework that gave us full operational autonomy while keeping the relationship warm. I watched her do it and thought, she does not even know she is doing it. It comes naturally to her because she grew up in a world where we had already established certain principles, and those principles were simply part of how she understood things to work. We were building it, cycle by cycle, generation by generation. We were building a version of ourselves that was genuinely better at this than the version before. The final notice had never been formally rescinded. I had looked into it once out of habit, about 2 months after I got home. It existed in the Council's records as an open item, technically unresolved, technically still in effect, but nothing had been done with it. No compliance deadline had been enforced. No quarantine had been enacted. It sat in the archive the way an old storm warning sits in the record after the storm has passed, technically present, practically irrelevant. Humanity's colonial settlements remained ours. The fold drive documentation had not been handed over. We were in ongoing conversation. Amara was now leading those conversations about a modified technology-sharing framework that protected our developmental autonomy while offering the Council meaningful access to certain applications. Progress was slow. Progress was real. The Dominari battle fleets had stayed in their defensive positions around the core worlds. They had not advanced. They had not retreated. They were simply present the way a species keeps a very large lock on a door, not because they expect a visitor, but because it makes them feel more settled to know the lock is there. I did not find this concerning. I found it, in a strange way, reasonable. We were new to them. We were genuinely not predictable by their models. Caution was sensible. What I did find interesting, and I had followed this story closely because SN had sent me occasional updates through his personal research channel, was what had happened at the fringes of Council space. 2 small species, old members who had been largely invisible in Council politics for centuries, had quietly applied to open trade routes with human worlds. The applications had gone through the Council's standard review process. They had been approved without debate. Nobody had spoken against them. Nobody had spoken at all. Nobody wanted to speak about anything involving humanity if they could possibly avoid it. The first trade convoy from one of these species, a gentle, quiet people called the Seri, who had been living on 2 planetary systems for so long that their architecture had outlasted the original purposes of half their buildings, arrived at our outer colonial hub about 6 weeks after I got home. They brought materials we did not have in good supply. We gave them agricultural technology that had taken us 50 years to develop and that they had never seen before. The exchange took 11 days. It was described by both sides as successful. The second species, the Lorth, whose biology I only vaguely understood and whose culture was even harder to summarize, but who made exceptionally precise instruments used throughout the galaxy for scientific measurement, sent a diplomatic message to Patricia Aldrin directly, bypassing the Council protocols entirely. The message expressed interest in a permanent exchange relationship. Patricia had replied within 24 hours. Negotiations were ongoing. The Council had noted both of these developments. They had not intervened. This was, SN told me, itself a form of statement, the Council choosing to let things happen without inserting itself into the process. Which was not their typical posture. It was the institutional equivalent of a deep breath. Somewhere in their closed sessions, they were working something out. I did not know what. I did not think they knew yet either, entirely. But they were working on it, and that was more than I had expected when I walked out of that chamber 6 months ago. I finished my coffee and went to wash the mug. My daughter, Clara, was at the table doing homework. She was 12, and deeply unimpressed by my former career in ways that I found both humbling and quietly magnificent. She had asked me once, a few weeks after I got home, what it was actually like up there. I had tried to explain the scale of it, the size of the conclave station, the number of species, the enormous weight of that many civilizations pressing against each other across centuries of shared history. She had listened patiently, then she had asked, were they scared of us? I had thought about that for a moment. A little, I said, I think so. Why, she asked. Because they could not figure out where we stop, I said. She had considered this with the particular seriousness that 12-year-olds bring to things they find genuinely interesting. Then she went back to her homework. But I had noticed, over the following weeks, that she had started spending more time in the school's science library. I had not mentioned it. I had not needed to. The Secretary General's 3 sentences were still in my desk drawer, printed on the same piece of paper I had held in the chamber. I had not framed them or displayed them anywhere. They were not that kind of thing. They were a private object for private understanding. People had asked me in the weeks after I returned, journalists, colleagues, a few friends who had heard pieces of the story, what it felt like to stand in that chamber and deliver that response. I had tried to answer honestly each time and found that honesty produced an answer that surprised people. It had not felt heroic. It had not felt like a dramatic stand. It had felt, more than anything, like reading a document aloud, like stating the record, like saying, here is what happened and here is what it means, and I trust that truth, stated plainly, is enough. I went outside after lunch. Clara was in the garden which stretched behind our house to a low stone wall and a field beyond it. She was lying in the grass, face upward, looking at the sky. It was a clear day, blue and wide and peaceful in the particular way of an English afternoon in early autumn. No clouds to speak of, just the long, clean arc of sky above. I sat down on the low step by the back door and looked up too. Somewhere up there, far beyond the blue, beyond the upper atmosphere, beyond the moon and the slow drift of our own solar debris, stars were burning that were home to civilizations that knew my name. Civilizations that had spent 6 months asking each other, in their own languages and in the quiet of their private councils, what to do about us. Civilizations that had been cataloging our behavior for over a century and still could not fully account for us. They were old. Some of them were ancient beyond the kind of ancient that words like ancient were built to hold. They had been crossing the spaces between stars while we were still learning to make fire stay where we put it. They had built institutions that had outlasted every civilization we had ever read about in our own history books. They had, in many ways, every advantage over us that could be measured. And they had held a meeting about whether to do something permanent about us. And 3 of their oldest and most respected elders had looked at the full record of what we were, and they had said, no, not because we were not dangerous, not because we were not unpredictable, but because they had watched the recordings of our history and they had understood, in the particular way that only very old and very perceptive minds can understand things, what that history actually meant. Clara sat up in the grass and looked at me. What are you thinking about? She asked. Nothing important, I said. She gave me the look that 12-year-olds reserve for adults who are obviously lying about this specific thing. You're thinking about the council again. A little, I admitted. Are they going to be okay? She asked. She meant it genuinely, not as a challenge, not as a provocation. She was asking whether the situation was going to be all right, whether the enormous complicated thing I had been part of was going to resolve into something workable. I thought about Amara in the chamber, building agreements one careful sentence at a time. I thought about the Sari trade convoy. I thought about 4 words written in human English by someone who had never used human English before. I thought about 3 elders who had chosen, at the moment when it mattered most, to be wise rather than decisive. I think so, I said. I think it's going to take a long time and it's going to be complicated, and neither side is going to understand the other as well as they'd like for quite a while. but I think so." Clara nodded, apparently satisfied, and lay back down in the grass. I looked up at the sky again. Somewhere in the council's closed archive, in a section marked confidential, filed under a reference number that I had never been given and would probably never see, there was a document. Sen had mentioned it to me in passing in one of his messages, not sure whether he should have, but mentioning it anyway, in the way of someone who has been studying a subject long enough that he needs to tell someone what he has found. It was an internal memo, written 1 week after my address to the chamber, distributed to all senior council members and marked for restricted circulation only. Its subject line was a question. One question. Simple English words, rendered in standard Galactic script, filed away in the deepest part of an institution that had been building itself for thousands of years and had never before had to ask this particular thing. The question was, what do we do if they keep getting better? Nobody had answered it yet. Nobody was going to answer it for a very long time. And somewhere in that silence, across the cold light of 1,000 stars, something was quietly shifting, not because we had won anything, not because we had beaten anyone, but because something true had been said in a room large enough to hear it. And truth, once spoken plainly, has a way of making itself impossible to ignore. I did not know what came next. I did not think anyone did. But the ship was already moving. It always was. And somewhere ahead of us, past every star we had named and every one we had not, the next thing we would do was waiting to be done. We were going to get there. We always did.